Our philosophies for legacy.
Next on Eternal Durdles.
Hello, everybody. Eternal Durdles is celebrating Bandmas this year by posting an episode every single weekday in December. That means like 20 episodes. As you can imagine, it is a gigantic lift for me. If you can support the channel by going to patreon.com/eternaldurdles for the low price of $5, you'll be getting an episode every single weekday in December, free of charge. That's just going to happen either way. And you'll be getting ad-free content and a bonus episode every week. So if you can do that, that's great. Thanks for watching. On with the show. Hello and welcome to Eternal Durdles. I'm your host, Zach Clark, and with me as always, Phil Bleckman. Phil, how's it going, man?
Zach, I'm excited to talk about the philosophies of legacy today. You know that I stand on Sensei's Divining Top as the format pillar that we should all be structured upon. But to correct that, some might say faulty thinking, we have with us today Andreas, a.k.a. EcoBaronen, here with us on the cast. Welcome to Eternal Durdles. We're excited to hear what your thoughts are on what the philosophy of legacy is or should be.
Thanks so much for having me, guys.
I'm
looking forward to this.
Yeah. So I want to start with you because, you know, people have at least heard Phil and I wax about this subject enough that they probably have an idea of what we're going to say. But your take is vastly different from ours, so I thought it would be cool to start out with yours. Follow up with Phil's and mine, and then kind of go back and forth and talk about like what the differences are, sort of poke and prod each different person's philosophy of how they feel the format should be. Eternal Durdles is proud to be sponsored by Moxfield.com. Moxfield is the best deck building website on the internet. You can find all of my and Phil's decks in links below, including decks from this episode. And if you do, you'll be directly supporting the channel.
Right. And thanks so much for the willingness to listen to that one. So for me, it's somewhat simple. I'm a competitive player. I attack Magic as a problem-solving assignment. So that means whatever the ban list is, I'm going to try and make the most of it. I will also say that I'm not totally opposed to thinking about what's fun, what's interesting, what could be improved. And I think the combination of where I'm coming from with, professional play, I play Magic every day, in combination with where you guys are, I feel like that combination is exactly why this piece of content is going to be very, very interesting. So I guess that's my vague stand on the health and the philosophy of legacy.
So basically what you're saying is whatever the ban list is what you're going to work with.
Yeah, for sure. And of course, a deck can be too dominating. I'm looking at numbers, I'm looking at conversion rates, I'm looking at win rates, rather than, oh, is this 40-year-old man having fun? Is this 50-year-old man having fun? So I just think that's too hard simply. So I'm a data guy when it comes to managing these formats.
So it's light touch, and I need to use just for men is really what it's coming down to. So Phil, with that said, Phil, let's talk about what your ideal philosophy is for legacy.
Yeah, so when the topic of us talking about specifically the philosophy of legacy and what we think it should be came up as an episode topic, it made me really sort of look internally at, because we talk a lot about the ban list and different tournaments and metagames across different time frames. And all of that, like over time, can be tough to sift down into like, how do we aggregate this to one thing that we should argue for? And I think the thing that ultimately I kept coming back to, because legacy now as a community-driven format, both from how we have to operate and also how WotC views us as legacy players as a community-driven format, that I think that the philosophy that I have is community sentiment, majority community sentiment for cards or play pattern experiences that are unfun should be removed, and then that's where we lean. Because I also like where EcoBaronen came in and saying that we should look at ways to solve problems. I mean, I've literally been trying to recreate miracles over the course of however many years now, trying to solve the problems that are in front of it. But what I found was, when I was looking really in depth about what does that actually mean to try and solve the problems, and what I found was there's the difference between when solving problems is an enjoyable experience versus when it isn't. And I found that when it's enjoyable, even when you're losing, it doesn't matter if that experience is being fulfilled in a way that makes you want to come back and the replayability is there. And so I think the philosophy of the format should be where the powerful cards can exist that wouldn't otherwise be able to exist in other formats, with the caveat that anything that creates a negative, repetitive play pattern that isn't fun to play should be removed.
Okay, it's funny that you guys are actually a lot closer than I thought you would be as far as overall philosophy is concerned, and that sort of bears out from how you build miracles. So that's actually pretty interesting. My philosophy is a little like it's more amorphous, but the idea for me is like Legacy is at its best when there are several different kinds of Delver decks. Like when you have, and not to say that the Delver deck has to be the best deck, but when that deck is the most viable, like is a viable deck, and you have several versions of it that each attack a certain part of the meta. So Sultai Delver has good permanent and creature removal. Rug Delver is good about attacking lands and dealing with combo decks. Blue Red Delver is like sort of almost a combo deck. It's like go to the face, pure velocity. Maybe you're playing Monastery Mentors to do extra damage. It's a damage-based deck, right? And so when you have a format that allows for all of those types of tempo decks to exist at the same time, it means that the format is, in my opinion, diverse enough for several different deck types to exist, because Delver has decided, okay, I have to try and find different ways to attack those decks, but no one's got a consensus on like this is the best version of the thing. To that end, we may well have passed a time where that is a viable philosophy. So that's kind of why I'm searching this topic out, because I think that a lot of people are in a state where they're living their best 2014 life, and maybe the format has moved on past that. So I think that's the first thing I want to talk about is it too late for the format to not be this sort of like ships passing the night 1-2 turn 2 combo thing, or is that something that you think is still very much part of the conversation? Andreas, that's pointed to you.
So two things here. What you're describing here of different flavors of not necessarily Delver, but what Delver is representing, I can relate to that. And I play a lot of Vintage, and that is kind of true in Vintage. You have different flavors of Luris. And the general sentiment, if we're trying to quantify, again, what is fun, what is balanced, is when a format has a Thera deck as the not necessarily dominating deck, but as a deck to beat, and you have ways to maneuver within that archetype, right? That is something that most players find interesting. Interacting is another thing that people really talk about when talking about healthy formats, and these fair decks are a great example of that. So sure, but I also do remember when Delver has been the best deck historically, that I have also seen a lot of negativity about the format whenever the best players in the world are playing the deck they think they can do the absolute best with. Delver will be like a 20-something% deck, and that has also been a problem in a lot of people's eyes. So I agree with what you said, but I also am scared of what the reaction to that metagame would be. So it could be unsolvable at this point. Who knows? I think it's a fair question to ask.
Yeah. I want to jump in and tag on the idea, because I agree with Andreas on the notion that it's how something interacts. I think to take that an additional step further, I think that like what players enjoy, and myself included, is when we say that we like interactive games, I think baked within that is we like games where our decisions matter. And I think when we have a format or cards that remove that sort of agency of our decisions mattering, our decisions of being there and making calculated decisions based on the information presented at hand, actually having some amount of consequence to the game that we're playing, I think when that is stripped in any capacity, whether a card is too powerful or a deck is too powerful, or there's a particular kind of interaction that strips that out, that becomes when we as a community then start to shift towards like, oh, this format is broken, or this era of Legacy isn't enjoyable anymore, and we're just going to do something else. I think that's when that sort of thing happens, which is I think what we're seeing a lot with now. Obviously, Vexing Bubble is sort of a straightforward point in that regard, but I think that's also what people are talking about when they move towards pressing against Psychic Frog. And let me know if we don't want to go into specifics about this particular current meta that we're in. But I think that, like, from my standpoint, playing all the white cards that I play, and I'm a heavy removal deck, like I'm happy to be playing against creatures that don't generate value immediately. And so I have felt the sting of Psychic Frog less than I feel like a lot of the community has, even though I'm a stalwart guy playing, a tier 6 deck. But I can see how a lot of agency for people in decks that they play. A lot of that agency they feel is removed because of Psychic Frog's existence, and so they put it in the same camp that I would put something like Vexing Bubble that cuts off my ability to interact on the stack. It's similar to why like there are problems that I have with things like Teferi Time Raveler. Now, Teferi Time Raveler obviously not on the chopping block, but it's another one of those cards where when Teferi shows up in too many games, if it showed up constantly and it was a high enough percentage of the metagame, I could see people responding to it similarly in the way that somebody might do Psychic Frog. And the thing that they have in common is stripping of that agency, stripping of being able to make decisions because a card just says you don't get to.
Yeah, it's interesting that you know, some of these cards. A perfect example is Psychic Frog. That they also tend to sort of soft ban other archetypes just by existing. Like, you know, one of the things I said in my ban and restricted announcement was like, I don't think that Psychic Frog should be banned based on the merits of the card, but the fact that the card is the best. It's the best tempo card to be playing, so everyone's kind of moved into that, and this goes back to my philosophy, moved into just Dimir as the tempo deck. So that's one of those things where, like, you know, sometimes the cards actually soft ban stuff too.
Zach, I would like actually to rally on that point, and then point a question at EcoBaronen here. In that regard of cards, a card's existence pushing things out of the format, one of the most steadfast things that we've had for years is the conversation surrounding Days and how Days compresses the format and makes it so that 4 drops, 5 drops, you know, unless there's cards that are winning the game or you're playing fast mana to offset the downside of them being expensive cards, Days just sort of removes those types of cards from seeing any play because of the card's existence. On the flip side of that, though, and this is the question I want to ask, when we're saying a card's existence stops other things from being able to see play, where would you consider the line of essentially decks or strategies or types of games that we want to, quote, protect? Because like Bowmaster cutting out, you know, a bunch of different things that we argue for, at what point is it reasonable to be like, yes, we would like to promote a game where you know, a bunch of X1s in a deck can all exist in the same place without fear of getting Bowmastered? Where do we actually navigate that line, Andreas? Where do you think like WotC should navigate? Where do we as Legacy should we, you know, push them towards?
Yeah, so first let me address the Psychic Frog issue about that being the best thing to be doing. I think that is correct. That has been correct in the past. Lightning Bolt also made Shock an unplayable card. That's how Magic works a lot of the time. So the thing is, I'm more worried about imagining a world without Psychic Frog. Then what fair decks are we realistically trying to run here to save the world? I wouldn't want to play a fair deck without Psychic Frog at the current stage. But to your point, Phil, about kind of Wizards, the way they print cards, they're kind of defining what can and cannot be done, and we've seen in other formats, Fury, Ren and 6 making X1s very bad, right? So right now, funnily enough, I just came from covering the Eternal Weekend in Europe, and we saw 2 Nadu decks with tons of X1s in their main deck in the top 8 because Orcus Bowmass is relatively low at the moment. So for me, it's more of an, what do you call it, ebb and flow in English? I believe that's the term, where, if Bowmass is a 4-off, I'm not going to run this Nadu Elves deck next weekend. And that's like the cat and mouse of, Mystic Force is all over the news. Guess what? It didn't do anything in neither the showcase nor the Eternal Weekend EU. I had to scroll way down to find the first copy. So in my opinion, it's just ebb and flows, and that's the challenge of it. And I do agree. There do exist some cards that could get to a certain stage where, this is a bit over the line, or this makes too much stuff irrelevant. So it's a balance thing for me. I just haven't seen it in a long time. I guess since let's see, I guess Grief was at the peak of its powers. That was definitely not something we wanted. I could definitely see that. And then before that, it was White Plume and Expressive Iteration. And they basically just took the 2 best decks. If you were trying to win a tournament, did not sign up with Initiative nor Delver, you were not trying to win the tournament. So they tried to level the playing field. And we can get to a spot like that again. I just don't think we're there now, looking at the 3 Eternal Weekends, collecting the data. So for me, the numbers doesn't make sense right now. But if they do at some point, I also support bans to keep more cards playable. I certainly enjoy having choices when I'm building my decks. No doubt about that.
So you brought up an interesting point here, the ebb and flow, that I kind of want to build on here. when I used to play Standard competitively, you basically, for every season of Standard, you needed 3 decks, because what would happen is week 1, everyone would be into X deck, and that deck would, dominate. Then everyone would decide, okay, here's the counter deck to that, and then play that. And generally what would happen is that everyone plays that deck that kills this deck, but the guy who wins the tournament is actually playing a deck that attacks that deck, right? So you have to have this like 3, you need to build basically 3 decks like a season to like figure out like, okay, now we're where I want to be for Standard. Porting that into Legacy is a little tougher, because building 3-4 decks, of course staples are going to move between decks, but not everyone has like a full collection, obviously, right? So do you think that that's like a good place for the format to be with that ebb and flow? Or do you think that, like with the ebb and flow that makes you have to be like, okay, well, like I need to pivot a full deck. Like I need to change my deck to this, knowing that like this is strong. Like if we look at, for example, Asia Eternal Weekend, Moonstompy, right? Moonstompy into Mystic Forge into Nadu Breakfast, right? And so if you were to look at like, okay, well, what's the next thing going to be? Like you could sort of extrapolate like, okay, if people are going to be on Nadu Breakfast, now I have to start playing my Orcish Bowmaster deck, let's say, right? Do you think that that's like particularly like a healthy place for Legacy to be, or that's just the state of the game now?
I think it's a relevant point, because cards, the price point is different. It's not just you go to your LGS, you splash $100 in your set. Like but I feel like this has been not a problem, but just a definition of the format for a while. So, and again, I want to highlight the tournament I covered this weekend. In the finals, we had 61 card Esper control deck with some obscure card choices. I had to read 2 of the cards. I play Legacy every day, and I have been for 20 years. Had to read some of the cards. So I'm just saying these exists. You can do, your expertise can power through the power level. So the point you're alluding to here is that in a perfect world, because we're also, oftentimes adults, so we don't have infinite time to play. I'm very lucky that I have, but it would be ideal that I could leave my deck in my drawer, and then 6 months after I can pick it up, make a few upgrades, and be competitive. That would be quite nice if that's the way we want to pull it. So it's also a matter of, do we want to be competitive and like Pro Tour style when it comes to Legacy, or we want to go more into the Commander side of things, where we have to account for a lot of other things aside from simply just the competitiveness. So I feel like that is a very, very important point to make when I'm giving my answer here, because my answers are going to vary a lot depending which direction we go.
Yeah. Well, Phil, that brings up a good point of the concept of deck rotation. You play Miracles, and you've been playing Miracles for a while. Obviously not an optimal tier 1 deck, but there is that concept of like format rotation that used to not necessarily be a thing in Legacy. Is that part of your philosophy, or do you think that maybe that's something that just is the format now, where rotation is necessary?
Well, I think it goes back. I mean, the rationale for why, like my philosophy that I was arguing before of it should be like the experience does matter, like whether or not a card is over the line, whether it comes to winning metrics or homogeneity of the format. If people are having fun, I think that is the thing that we can all agree should be optimized, because even if the numbers line up and nothing is too good, on paper, and then also that the people are still showing up for tournaments and whatnot because they want to play. I think there's a catch-22 of when we look at like tournament, like people showing up, like essentially tournament attendance versus quality of a format, because people want to play Legacy, and it's a double-edged sword. If they don't show up for Legacy, then WotC assumes that something is wrong and then doesn't support the format. So people still want to play even if a format is not great and needs correction, which I think is what we're seeing, because it doesn't seem like anybody's really content with the format right now or thinks that it needs some amount of improvement. So when it goes to the my thing that you're asking with Miracles and Sensei's Dividing Top getting removed, I'm just on the other side of what the majority was, right? At the time, people were like, I don't like the experience of playing against Sensei's Top. And so they removed it, even though I would argue that Top wasn't too good at the time on the numbers compared to, bans that have happened since then. I think you could argue that like the power level of Sensei's Top for where the format is now, like if you could argue that like when Sensei's Top was around, the format was slower because the format had to slow down in order to solve the counterbalance problem with Top. And so they had to put in answers that, effectively slowed the format down. So games were longer. Whereas right now we're on the other side of that, where games are faster because they feel like they need to go underneath the Psychic Frog decks, what we see with the Vexing Bobble combo decks, or and so we just see like those sort of decks clashing against each other when we get this more ships passing in the night. So with regard to like what you're asking me, I think that like it still fits the philosophy, even though that particular ban is something that goes against what I would like to do. I still think that like if the majority of the field feels as though Sensei's Divining Top is creating a negative experience, and we want to have a positive overall experience, I can find other things that can be pleasant for my style of gameplay.
I have a few things here, if you don't mind, Zach.
Yeah, please.
Regarding the miracles, I remember playing back then. That was when I started to get like real competitive and playing pro Magic and stuff like that. And I feel like that deck was if we apply some of the stuff we already talked about stuff making other stuff obsolete. I think that deck was quite good at doing that as well, setting up Terminus reliably. I remember I played it at my local Legacy Nationals. I played the deck for the first time. I played against a few Elves decks, and that was just like a brutal blowout for those guys when I found my Terminus time and time again, and also counterbalance. So you said that forced the other decks to vary their mana values, which is true. That is, but that is also a deck that's highly impacting what the others are going to do. And I found that just as exciting as now, where combo decks are leaning on Vexing Bubble, I should have more 1-mana answers. So everything to me just sounds like very similar experience to how I approach it in a competitive way. With that being said, I love playing that deck, and if people weren't so slow in paper, maybe you would even have the chance to play the card today.
Yeah, it's also interesting because like the notion that like Vexing Bubble leading players to needing to have one or more mana answers as opposed to free counter magic, and the way where Counterbalance did similar things of people needing to either spread their CMCs or play things like Abrupt Decay in their deck, which is a reactive removal spell, therefore it slows the game down. I think it's interesting to think about like which the ways that those cards, even though they have similarities in that they compel the format to do other things, that which are the one difference between those two types of cards, between Countertop and something like Vexing Bubble, is I feel as though Vexing Bubble it demands similar things that Counterbalance did, but then incentivizes the decks to be faster that are playing it. Whereas Countertop was a deck that was naturally slower, so there was just more opportunity for decisions in game to actually have time, because games develop in a way that they don't when presented against a Vexing Bubble. Now, not that that's necessarily bad one way or the other. Like, one could argue they don't want to play, long, grindy games. They want to play faster games, and then vice versa. So
yeah,
there's some give and take there, but I think it's interesting. I didn't think before about how Countertop was similar to Vexing Bubble in terms of what its implications are in format.
A point I want to make that makes, in my opinion, the Countertop situation slightly different than Vexing Bobble is what I call lies in design. Vexing Bobble was created not with the intention of making combo decks easier. It was like, you can tell by the design of like how Modern was going at the time. They were like, well, maybe we can just like stop people from doing the free spell like guys and then putting them in off of the graveyard from whatever blink effect that they had. Whereas like Countertop, you knew what you were getting. Like no one designed Counterbalance and was like, this will go in a really fast deck. There was no chance of that happening. Just an aside I wanted to point out.
I have a little insight on the design of a Vexing Bubble. Actually, I'm not going to say any names here, but I'll just say that it zero thoughts were given with regards to Vintage and Legacy. It was a card designed for Modern to keep Garif and Fury legal. And that's no longer the case. So this is why, we're kind of left with this untested potential problem, right? So it's basically just to say that nobody ever thought about this as a legacy card. So it was mainly not considering it. That's the problem, I guess.
I think that's a piece of the design philosophy we can sort of all agree on, is like cards entering formats should be tested for those formats.
In that regard, since we live in a world where that's just never going to be true, right? Yeah. There will never be a time where they are testing cards for Legacy. And I mean, potentially a whole different discussion, but to put it on people's radar, potentially for a future episode where Andreas comes back to join, where we talk about ban list philosophy for different formats. But I think that there's, for Legacy, we touched on this an episode or two ago, where I was arguing for, because Legacy gets more cards than any other format outside of Vintage at a faster clip, because we also get the Commander product, that means that the way that they curate the ban list also needs to account for the fact that it's getting more cards than any other format per pool, even though they're not testing for those things. So the way that they would curate for Modern or for Pioneer or for Standard, where they know how many cards are going in, it's limited by comparison. They can take a more touch and go approach that's more conservative, where I was arguing that because we get such an influx, particularly for cards that are designed for 4-player, not 1v1, that they should have a more aggressive stance towards banning or curating the Legacy ban list. Same thing with Vintage, granted that it's restricted at most, for the most part. But probably not for now, but curious on Andreas' thoughts.
So while, of course, everything you said is true, I just think the bar is equal, like, the comparison is just higher for Legacy, so I think that solves a lot of these things. But yeah, sometimes a card can, take a format by storm because zero thoughts were giving into it. And then, we can have a couple of months with suboptimal metagames and stuff. So yeah, it definitely comes with the territory, and it's tough for WotC. They don't, aside from giving from promos for Eternal Weekend, I don't think they care too much about Legacy and Vintage. So I think we're just left with that reality for the future here. And also, whenever there's a standard set released and there's zero interesting cards for Legacy, I saw you guys sometimes do some preview and stuff. I mean, it must also be cool to preview some powerful stuff rather than
preview so many cards.
Yeah,
like that used to be a knob that we'd twist every couple of months and be like, oh, 3 or 4 cards from this set, 3 or 4 cards from this set. Now it's like every month we're like, okay, 20 more cards that you might see in Legacy.
Yeah, and looking back, not a lot of those are bangers in Legacy, right? So I'm just saying there's also a balance between, I think they turned up the hot water at some point and really had to keep up that standard, and that's that can bite you in the butt if you don't enjoy this snowball-y, because threats don't take a lot of turns to win the game these days. No. I play a lot of Vintage Cube, and it's kind of the same. Like when I played Vintage Cube 5 years ago, it was way different. Now, really turning up the heat on the threats, ending the games faster. So yeah, Legacy has fewer decisions, but more important decisions in the first handful of turns compared to earlier. Because don't get me wrong, I also enjoyed playing a land and passing the turn, waiting for my opponent to do something. Sculpt with Brainstorm, Stoneforge Mystic, Maverick type decks, Death and Taxes. I mean, I love that
Harken
as well.
to a time when True Name Nemesis was the biggest threat in the format.
We've never actually talked about that specifically, but I know that comes up quite often, is the difference between being able to make many micro decisions over the course of a game versus fewer decisions that have a more significant impact because there are fewer decisions. And so I wonder if, where is there even a way to navigate what that line would look like for what we would consider healthy? Like, I'm not totally sure. I guess that's why we've never really delved too far into it, because I don't even know necessarily how to articulate that in a way that's constructive or useful. But at what point do we go, okay, the format is in a place where there are too few decisions, even though they are impactful ones, versus, okay, you have to make way too many decisions, and even though they impact the games way less, like we are just burned out by, having to do this constantly, and that's not fun either. Like, where is that range for you guys? I guess it's more of a subjective question because everybody's going to be different. But where do you guys fall on that spectrum?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned it because it's very, very subjective. Some people love these combo decks, solving the puzzle, trying to thread the needle and just get there versus whatever disruption they think their opponent might be holding. So I think it's very good to just say that, yes, we're talking about our subjective opinions here. We're not stating facts. We're not reading from the Bible, or we're not in a physics room. We're not this is not something you can quantify with anything else but solid arguments and personal preferences, right? So definitely good call here. We don't want tournaments to go to time everyone. The game is complex enough as it is. So maybe you could do some stats on average amount of turns in a tournament, compare from year to year, something along those lines, and you try and find some reason. I don't even know what the average amount of turns would be in Legacy right now. I have no idea. Maybe it's 5, maybe it's
We're going to have Matt Chow on later this week, and one of the things, sort of, he's all about like the data, But one of the things that like I'm kind of bummed about is we don't have that. Like you don't get that data in a match. Like you don't like, oh, I'm on to my turn 7. Let me report turn 7, down. Or the coin flip is like another piece of data that like I would really love to have like for live events. There's just no great way to record that in paper when you're doing like the events that matter for the year,
Right.
Well, yeah, go on.
Before we jump into the next thing, to echo that sentiment, I also wonder if how much. And this is also something I'm just very curious of Andreas's thoughts on things, because I like how you and I feel like have very differing viewpoints, but we sort of like end up like converging towards similar things, even though we very much come from it from different ends. And so when it comes to tournament logistics, there are cards that we may not cover the line. And I'm bringing this up specifically because we've talked about Fraud, we've talked about Bobble to an extent, and now it translates from previous cards that might relate. One thing that we haven't talked about, which might present itself for tournament logistics, is Nadu. And Nadu had a very good Eternal Weekend performances, whether it be with Cephalid Breakfast or with the just like Nadu Elves style lists. And I wonder where your stance is on cards that impose tournament logistics similar to Nadu, because the only real, I'm not to make this about miracles, but the only real other card that I can think about that argued for tournament logistics and the reason why it had to be removed was Sensei's Top.
Yes.
And so I'm curious your thoughts on where the line is for a card imposing some amount of tournament logistical nightmares. Nightmares, not trying to be a word to lead the witness here, but you know what I'm asking. Where do you fall on that for cards when it becomes too much?
Yeah, it's definitely a balance. And I remember I played at the Pro Tour with that where that card was all over the shop, and of course it was too high of the metagame. It was too good in the context of Modern, and it was super confusing to watch on coverage. And even back then, players didn't fully figure out how to visibly show which cards they already targeted once, which card they targeted twice, etc. But I think they got way better at this already. And in combination with the power level being way more reasonable in Legacy, I think it's fine for now. I want to see the metagame react. Just like the Mystic Forge had great weekends, Reanimator has been awesome. But once people start and account for these decks, I feel like Nadu will land at a reasonable power level for Legacy. And I'm actually confident that some Grafdigger's Cages and some Toxic Deluges will take care of that once people start respecting it. Maybe even some Bowmasters back in the mix. And it's actually, I don't think it's that bad. We do see some premature concessions against Nadu, but they aren't really premature, right? It's kind of the foregone conclusion.
Yeah,
and actually, players were quite good at showing how and how many times they activate it. So actually, it's definitely close to the line. Let me put it that way when it comes to logistics, but I think it's acceptable.
I have a question because I didn't play Modern with Nadu in it. What was the trigger for Nadu? Was it just Shuko? Was there some other card?
You use Shuko and you use Springheart Nantuko, which is creating the 1/1, so that's kind of your redundancy. And then a card like Bristly Bill can also give you redundancy. But yeah, Shuko, Ursa Saga, that's like...
Got it. So it's mostly sorcery speed, right?
Yep.
So I think that's the difference between how I feel about it in how people feel about it in Modern and how people feel about it in Legacy.
Yep.
Because if for the most part, you have a pretty good chance of having either sorcery speed level interaction or instant speed interaction. The instant speed interaction is so easy to keep track of. When I'm playing, I'm just like targeting this. Okay, great. Like if your opponent responds, you're just going to target. You're just like, I'm going to do it 8 times. You know? Whereas like if you're on Shuko, I can see like if the interaction is happening in Modern, and it's like, okay, I'm going to target this. Okay, in response, I'm going to do this. Okay, like then you have to keep track of how many times Nadu has targeted something. Maybe you have to cast another Shuko and then keep going from there. But I feel like in Legacy, it's just like you're just like, and I'm drawing 8 cards. Like you just flip over 8 cards and you're like, these are the lands, they go here. These are the cards that go into my hand. I think Larson did a really good job of even keeping those face up during his matches. So he was like, here's what you've seen,
Yeah, so I agree. The tools available were less powerful in Modern, but so was the opposition, right? The tools are better in Legacy Nadu decks, but the tools against it are also better. I think especially just like Nomad plus Cephalid Illusionist, you can never allow those two cards to be on the table at the same time either, and that has been fine for a lot of years. So it's mainly the logistics that I think is important here. If we're, does this take too long? Too many judge calls? Oh yeah, you already targeted that thing twice. Well, how do we realize if I did that or not? We cannot always check the footage, right? So
of course,
it can be a bit, it's definitely approaching the line. I don't want any more confusing cards to enter anytime soon. It's definitely, it's
the
close.
Cognitive load there would be a lot. So, okay, so getting to the end here, I wanted to ask you a question that Phil sort of brought up about like total, like when we're talking about the philosophy of the tournament and like, or the philosophy of the format and how people feel about the format, and thinking about how okay, I gotta come out to play Legacy because WotC cares about these sort of things, and so this year we didn't have a painting at any of the Eternal Weekends, right? But we had record turnout, I think, for Eternal Weekend, at least in North America. How many people were in the
almost
EU?
900? So it went up for both, or maybe all three continents. I didn't do my homework on the Japanese one, but at least for the US and the European one, the attendance went up from last year. So I was happy to see that. To Phil's point, could be for the love of Legacy, despite a bad state. So I could so from my opinion, I'm like, why did tournaments get canceled in the summer, but people are now ready to rock out and support Eternal Weekend? I mean, for me, I don't see the actual proof, but I couldn't prove the opposite either. It's mainly just to say that my guess is as good as you guys is when it comes to the high attendance.
I think one of the things is like people love the format. Obviously, it's the level of loyalty to the format is pretty high. But I think one of the like weird pitfalls that we kind of run into sometimes is like, if not enough people come out of the tournament, Wizards doesn't care. If too many people come out to the tournament when something like, oh, we're not doing paintings anymore, but people still came out in droves, like that sometimes I feel like that can incentivize Wizards to be like, well, we don't need to do paintings anymore. People are still coming out. They don't even care about the paintings.
I remember
that
this
sort of stuff.
Speaking about Wizards cutting stuff and people still attending, when I played a lot of GPs during the 2010s, they removed coverage at some point.
Yeah.
And then they removed the PT qualification for the 13-2 players only for the top 8 now. They increased the entrance fee, and people still showed up. Modern GP is still sold out. So what does that tell you as a company? I mean, I know what I would do.
You got to follow the numbers. Yeah, I mean,
I know what I would do, but I'm also very, especially with Legacy and Vintage, I would want to make sure that I keep my enfranchised players and give them a good reason to stick around, because we get more responsibilities in our life in general, and generally less spare time on average over the years, right? So why would we hang around when our collections are getting so expensive, right? We can buy a house or keep our cards. Please give us a good reason to keep the cards, so those cards don't end up in some storage somewhere.
Yeah. Phil, final thoughts?
I'm really mostly curious. Like, I feel like this is the most the deepest dive we've earnestly had on like what the philosophy of the format should look like, because the format has, in the last 5 years, or really since COVID, like since that time, 2019 pre-fire, like, let me articulate that more clearly. I feel like the format has changed so much more rapidly since Fire Design in 2019 came around. And then the follow-up of that, of them moving towards printing for Commander product rather than for Standard because of the COVID lockdowns, that we are in a whole new Legacy than what we nostalgically remember. And so the philosophy of Legacy sort of felt a little bit more inherent than what it used to be, or from what it is now. It sort of naturally felt more aligned and in tune to a degree. I get that might not make tangible sense, but I feel like everybody sort of has this vibe of what 2014 Legacy used to be. And we like sort of clamor for that, but not really fully being able to articulate what that actually is, or what they would like to see in the future in a way that can exist in a way now. And so I'm, rather than harp on anything that I've talked about, I'm more so curious to hear hopefully other podcasts talk about this, or people in the comments sharing what they think Legacy philosophy should look like going forward, because we do have access to talk to the guys at WotC. We've done that at MagicCons. We do have a line to them to be able to translate this sort of information. And so I think that, like, if we have a more collective idea that can actually articulate what that is, then maybe there is something to be had, a working relationship to actually get to a place closer to that idea that we don't seem to be at now because it is a topic of conversation.
Andreas, do you have any final thoughts?
I mean, I highly enjoyed this, as I alluded to when the two of us spoke earlier. I enjoy differences. I enjoy different point of views. It doesn't matter if it's religion, politics, or magic. It's awesome to hear everybody's view on the same thing, but we just have different perspectives, right? So I was just happy that I could engage in a respectful conversation, coming from a different place, getting inspired. It's my main thing when it comes to magic. I want to inspire people. I want to get inspired. I don't want to copy anybody's homework, and you shouldn't copy mine either. But I want to get inspired and get out wiser than I entered. And you guys succeeded in making
Awesome.
that true.
Yeah, this was thoroughly enjoyable. That's my final thought. This was thoroughly enjoyable. It was a lot of fun, and when we were talking about it, I was like, man, I really want to make sure that this doesn't become this antagonistic mess. We're all just like, you don't want to see anything banned. You just want to live in 2014. You just want your pet deck to work. And I think we achieved that. So that was that. Mission accomplished, as they say. Andreas, it's been a pleasure having you on the show. We really appreciate you coming back on after the BNR announcement, which is where we kind of cultivated this idea when we were talking during your recording of the BNR announcement. So it's one of the things I really like about doing that is I get to sit online for 10, 15 minutes and just BS with people. And then, we have a new friend on the cast,
Definitely. I'll be back anytime you want me.
Awesome. All right. Well, everybody, thank you for watching, and we'll catch you next time. Before you go, I need some help. Please subscribe to this channel and do your part to help sustain the legacy content ecosystem. Just subscribing to this channel goes a long way to reminding YouTube that people love and support this format. Now, if you really want to go the extra mile, you should think about supporting us through Patreon. Both the links for subscription and Patreon are right here. And if you're listening on an audio format, you can go to patreon.com/eternaldurdles. Thanks so much for watching.